The night the storm came, it came without mercy. Ilara Voss had lived in the Ashford Mountains long enough to know the difference between a winter that warned you and a winter that hunted you. And this one, rolling in from the northern peaks like something alive and furious, was the second kind. She had watched it build all afternoon from the frost-rimmed window of her cabin, the sky turning that particular shade of bruised violet that meant the temperature would drop another 15 degrees. Before midnight, the kind of cold that found the gaps in your walls and reminded you that the wilderness had never truly agreed to share itself with human beings. She had stoked the fire high, pulled the extra blanket from the cedar chest her grandmother had left her, and told herself she would not go outside for anything short of a genuine emergency. She had meant it when she said it. She found the wolf at 11:47 in the evening. She had gone out only because one of her outdoor temperature sensors had given a reading that seemed impossible, a malfunction she needed to physically check because the backup heating system for her small animal recovery unit was tied to that sensor, and she had 3 foxes and a barn owl recovering from various injuries in there that could not survive a heating failure on a night like this. That was the only reason she had laced up her insulated boots and pulled on her heaviest coat and stepped out into a storm that hit her like a wall of white noise. She had checked the sensor, confirmed it was indeed a malfunction, manually overridden the heating system, and was turning back toward her front door when her flashlight caught something dark against the snow 10 feet to her left. Her first thought was that it was a fallen branch. Her second thought, arriving immediately after when the shape registered more completely in her mind, was that it was far too large and far too wrong in its proportions to be a branch. She stood very still, for 3 seconds, the wind screaming around her. And then she walked toward it, because Ilara Voss had spent 8 years as a wildlife veterinarian in these mountains, and she had learned that the only thing worse than walking toward an unknown dark shape in a blizzard was walking away from one that turned out to be a suffering animal. It was a wolf. She understood that immediately once she was close enough, the flashlight beam cutting through the snow to illuminate black fur so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. An enormous wolf, the largest she had ever seen outside of photographs, easily twice the size of any natural specimen she had treated in her career, which was the first thing that made her pause. The second thing that made her pause was the blood, dark against the snow, pooling from a wound at his left shoulder that was deep enough and wide enough to suggest not claws or teeth, but something with a deliberate edge. The third thing that made her pause, the thing that sent a current of something she could not name straight through her chest, was the marking. It ran along his left flank, partially obscured by the matting of blood and snow, but visible enough in the beam of her light to be unmistakable. Not a scar, not a brand, not any natural pattern in his coat. It was a symbol, intricate and precise, rendered in fur that was somehow a different quality than the rest of him, slightly luminescent in a way that had nothing to do with her. Flashlight, a circular design with lines radiating outward in a pattern that tugged at something in the back of her memory, something old and half forgotten, like a word in a language she had known as a child and nearly lost. Her hand moved toward it before she could decide to move it, stopping an inch from his fur. The wolf opened his eyes. They were golden, not amber, not yellow, not the reflective gleam of animal eyes caught in artificial light. Golden, the way certain old metal was golden, warm and deep and impossible. And they looked at her with an intelligence that hit her like a physical force, not the intelligence of an animal assessing a threat, the intelligence of a mind, conscious and aware and suffering, looking at her and making a decision about her in real time. She made her own decision. "Okay," she said aloud, to herself, to him, to the storm. "Okay, I've got you." Getting him inside was one of the hardest physical tasks she had ever accomplished. He was dead weight, unconscious again within seconds of that eye contact, and he was massive in a way that defied any reasonable explanation she could construct. She used the emergency sled she kept in her equipment shed, the one she used for moving large injured animals, and she used every technique she had learned across 8 years of fieldwork, and she talked to him the entire time in the low, steady voice she used for frightened animals, telling him he was going to be fine, telling him she had him, telling him The cabin was close, telling him the warmth was coming. She could not have said why she felt so certain that talking to him mattered. She felt it nonetheless. She got him inside. She got him onto the large padded mat she normally reserved for the biggest dogs her neighbors occasionally brought to her. Pushed near enough to the fireplace that the heat would reach him, but not so close as to cause thermal shock. And she began to work. The wound was bad. She had seen bad wounds before, and she understood, with the clinical part of her mind that she had spent years training to operate independently of the emotional part, that this wolf should probably not be alive. The injury was too deep, too precisely placed just below a major muscle group to be accidental, and there was something about it that reminded her, uncomfortably, of a surgical strike, rather than a fight. Something had tried very hard to kill this animal in a very specific way. She cleaned the wound. She stitched it. She administered what she could from her veterinary supplies, working on a dosage calculation that was largely guesswork given his impossible size. And she monitored his breathing and his temperature and the color of his gums, and she did everything she knew how to do. Around 3 a.m, when his vital signs had stabilized enough that she felt she could sit back for a moment without catastrophe, she finally let herself look at the marking again. It was clearer now that he was dry and still, and inside. The symbol ran from just behind his left shoulder blade to just above his hip, roughly 18 inches long, detailed in a way that no natural variation in fur pigmentation could account for. The lines were clean. The design was intentional. It looked, she thought, like something between a rune and a constellation map, like someone had looked at a particular arrangement of stars and decided it meant something important enough to encode permanently onto something living. And it still had that faint luminescence, that quality of giving off rather than reflecting light, that she had noticed outside, and that she could not explain, and that she was, for the moment, choosing not to think too hard about. She fell asleep in the armchair beside him sometime before dawn, her hand resting on the mat 8 inches from his massive flank, close enough to feel the warmth of him, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in 4 months. She woke to silence and the smell of coffee. That was wrong. She lived alone. She had lived alone for 4 years, since the accident that had taken Daniel, and taken the version of herself that had existed before it. And there was nobody in her cabin who could be making coffee. She understood this in the first foggy moments of consciousness, and then understanding sharpened into alertness with a speed that had her upright in the armchair before she was fully awake, her eyes going immediately to the mat by the fire. The wolf was gone. In his place, sitting on the floor with his back against the stone of the fireplace surround and a mug of her coffee in his hands, was a man. He was tall, even folded down against the floor like that, with the kind of build that made the room seem slightly smaller around him, broad through the shoulder and chest in a way that suggested not cultivated muscle, but something more fundamental, something structural. His hair was black, the same absolute black as the wolf's fur, slightly longer than might be, strictly practical, and his skin had that quality of someone who spent the majority of their existence outdoors. He was wearing the emergency blanket she kept in her kit, wrapped around his waist in a way that covered the essentials and nothing else. Because of course he was. Because what else would a man who had appeared from nowhere in her living room be wearing? His eyes, when he looked up at her across the short distance of the room, were golden. Exactly as golden as the wolf's had been. "You make very good coffee," he said. His voice was low and even, and carried an accent she couldn't place. Something old-fashioned in the cadences, like someone who had learned the language from books written a long time ago. "I hope you don't mind. I needed something warm." Alara had 2 advanced degrees, 8 years of field experience, and a practical nature that had served her extremely well in a life that had required a great deal of managing difficult situations with clarity and efficiency. She looked at this man, sitting in the place where a critically injured wolf had been, drinking her coffee, with the firelight making his skin glow, and his impossible gold eyes watching her with that same awareness she had seen in the wolf's gaze the night before. And she did the reasonable thing. She reached for the fireplace poker. "That's fair," he said immediately, making no move to rise or to step back. simply watching her with something in his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile if the circumstances had been less strange. I would also reach for the nearest weapon, but I'd like to explain before you decide whether to use it. Start explaining, she said. She kept the poker in her hand. She kept it between them. He looked down at the mug for a moment, and she noticed the marking then, the one she had spent half the night tracing with her eyes on his other form. It was there on his chest, now rendered in skin rather than fur, the same symbol in lines that were slightly raised and faintly, impossibly luminescent, the same design that had caught her flashlight in the storm. He looked back up at her. "My name is Kaelin Ashwood," he said. "2 nights ago, 3 members of my council attempted to kill me. They used a curse bound in old blood magic, the kind that is meant to trap a shapeshifter in animal form until he dies of the injury they gave him alongside it. They expected me to die in the storm." He paused. "You were not part of their calculation." Ilara looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. The storm had passed, and the morning light was coming through the frost-covered windows in long, pale bars. She was a woman with advanced degrees and a practical nature, and 8 years of experience in an isolated mountain range that had taught her, among other things, that the world contained things that her formal education had not adequately addressed. "Shapeshifter," she said. "Yes, that marking on your chest. It was on the wolf last night. It is always on me, in both forms. It is my mark of office, among other things." His jaw tightened slightly. "It is also part of what made me a target. The mark cannot be forged. It cannot be transferred, which means anyone who wanted to claim my position would need me gone, rather than simply replaced. Your council tried to kill you. 3 members of it. I don't yet know if the others were involved or merely negligent." Something cold moved through his golden eyes. "I intend to find out." Ilara set the poker down, not because she had decided he was safe, but because she had decided he was telling the truth. And the truth of what he was saying had implications large enough that she needed her hands free to think properly, which was a thing she did with her hands when the situation was sufficiently complicated. She crossed her arms instead, which was nearly as useful. "The curse," she said. "You said it was meant to trap you until you died of the injury. But you're here." You changed back. Something shifted in his expression. The careful, measured tone remained, but something underneath it changed. Something that might have been, in a different man in a less contained moment. Something like vulnerability. "The curse required that I remain without genuine care, a wounded animal left to die. The magic was specific. If someone tended to the wound with genuine intent, and no knowledge of what I was, the blood binding would break." He looked at her, steadily. "You had no idea what I was." "I had some ideas by the time I'd been stitching you up for 2 hours, she said, which was true. "A wolf your size doesn't exist. That marking doesn't exist. And the way you looked at me," she stopped. "But you helped anyway," he said. "You were suffering," she said, as if this settled the matter. Because for her it did. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something that moved through his eyes, and was gone before she could name. "Yes," he said quietly. "I was." And then, after a pause, "Thank you, Ilara." She had not told him her name. If you are watching this, and you have ever made a choice based entirely on the fact that something was suffering and needed help regardless of what it was or what it might become, then you already understand something fundamental about who Ilara Voss was. Go ahead and leave a comment below telling us what you would have done, because honestly, the debate in our community about that opening scene is one we want to have. And while you're thinking about it, let's keep going, because this story is only getting started. The explanation of how he knew her name took the better part of an hour and introduced Ilara to a set of facts about her own history that her mother had apparently decided she did not need to know. Kaelin delivered these facts with the careful precision of someone who understood that information, given too quickly to someone unprepared for it, caused the kind of shock that made people stop listening. And whatever else he was clearly someone practiced in managing difficult conversations. He refilled her coffee without being asked, which she noted, and he sat back down in the same position against the fireplace, without crowding her space. which she also noted. And he told her about the Guardians de Frontera. The Guardians of the Threshold were, as Kaelin explained it, a lineage rather than an organization, a bloodline that had existed in parallel to the supernatural world for as long as the supernatural world had existed in its current organized form. They were human, entirely and genuinely human, without shifting ability or elemental magic or any of the other markers that defined the various supernatural communities of this part of the world. What they had instead was perception, a native ability to see the supernatural world clearly, to move through it without being reshaped by it, to understand its rules without being bound by them. They had served, historically, as mediators, record keepers, healers, and in certain critical moments, as the neutral parties who could act when every supernatural actor was too entangled in politics or power to act without bias. They had also been systematically targeted for 3 generations by factions within the supernatural community who considered their neutrality dangerous. Ilara's grandmother had been killed for what she knew. Her mother had gone into hiding, changed her name, moved to the most isolated location she could find, and raised her daughter as a perfectly ordinary human child with no connection to anything extraordinary, which had been, in Kaelin's careful phrasing, a decision made from love and fear, in roughly equal measure. Her mother had died in a car accident 4 years ago, 2 weeks after Ilara's partner Daniel had died in the same accident, which Ilara had spent 4 years believing was exactly what it appeared to be. A winter road. Ice. 2 deaths that should not have happened. She had moved to this cabin in this mountain range and become a woman who treated injured wildlife and did not let herself want things she might lose, and she had built a life around the shape of that grief. It wasn't an accident, she said. She said it flatly, because she had learned that flat was the only way to say certain things without breaking. I don't know, Kaelin said, and she believed him because his voice held the same flatness she recognized. The flatness of someone who understood that not knowing was sometimes worse. I know your mother was being watched in the years before her death. I know there were factions that wanted the Guardian lineage eliminated entirely. I cannot tell you with certainty what happened to her. He paused. But I can tell you that finding out is possible, and that I have both the resources and the motivation to help you do it. What's your motivation? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the careful honesty of someone choosing transparency as a strategy rather than an instinct, which she found more trustworthy than performed openness would have been. Partly strategic. A guardian aligned with the Ashwood territory would be politically significant. Having your cooperation and your trust would be genuinely useful to me as I work to reclaim my position and identify who in my council moved against me. He met her eyes. And partly because you saved my life last night with nothing to gain from it and everything to lose if I had been the wrong kind of creature. And I find that I am not indifferent to that. Ilara looked at him for a long moment. That's a very honest answer for someone trying to recruit me. I find that honesty is more efficient than alternatives, he said. You are clearly a person who will see through anything else. She thought about the last 4 years. She thought about her mother and Daniel in the cabin, and the way she had made herself small and safe, and isolated because small and safe and isolated meant nothing else could be taken from her. She thought about the wolf in the snow, and the marking that had glowed faintly in the beam of her flashlight, and the way her hand had moved toward it, before she decided to move it, drawn by something she had not been able to name. You should eat something, she said, because the other things she was thinking were too large for the morning. I'll make breakfast. And then you're going to tell me everything else you know. The beginning of that smile appeared again. Warmer this time. Yes, he said. I will. The days that followed existed in a kind of suspended time. The particular strangeness of 2 people thrown together by crisis, learning the shape of each other in real time, while the world outside the cabin continued to be dangerous. Kaelin could not leave immediately. The blood curse had been broken, but it had left him weakened in ways that required rest. The magical equivalent of blood loss, he explained. A depletion that pushing against would risk a relapse into a form he might not be able to control. He needed 3 to 5 days. He was accustomed to needing nothing from anyone. That much was obvious in the way he asked for things, carefully and precisely, and with an undercurrent of discomfort at the asking. She found it interesting, rather than annoying. She gave him the spare room and the loan of some of Daniel's old clothes, which still lived in a box in her closet, because she had not been ready to give them away, and she did not explain this, and he did not ask, simply accepted the worn flannel shirts and the jeans that were slightly too short for him, with a gravity that told her he understood something of what the gesture cost. She went back to her work, the 3 foxes and the barn owl, and the various administrative tasks of a one-woman wildlife rehabilitation operation, and she let him find his own rhythm in the cabin, rather than managing him, which seemed to be the right instinct, because he relaxed marginally within the first 24 hours in a way that suggested he had expected to be managed, and was surprised not to be. He read. She had an extensive library, weighted heavily toward biology and ecology and natural science, but with a secondary layer of mythology and folklore that she had collected over the years out of a professional interest in the intersection of human storytelling and animal behavior. He moved through it, methodically, occasionally asking her about specific texts, and she discovered in the process of these conversations that his knowledge was both vast and oddly gapped, comprehensive on some subjects, and entirely absent on others in ways that gradually began to make sense as she understood more about how he had grown up, the heir to a supernatural territory, educated in the politics and history and governance of a world that had only limited overlap with the human one. "You've never watched a movie," she said, on the second evening, when this gap in his experience became apparent. "I've seen films," he said, with the careful precision she was beginning to recognize as his version of defensiveness. "In a theater? Chosen by yourself?" A pause. "At state functions. Chosen by protocol." She laughed. It surprised her when it came out, genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she had mostly stopped producing in the last 4 years. He looked at her when she laughed with an expression she could not immediately categorize, something open and unguarded in return, as if her laugh had caught him equally off guard. "What would you recommend?" he said, and it was the first time she had heard him ask a question that didn't have a tactical component. They watched 3 films over the next 2 evenings, chosen by her with a curator's attention to what might genuinely matter to someone experiencing the form for the first time, rather than what was merely impressive. She watched him more than the screen, which she justified to herself on the grounds that his reactions were a more interesting study than films she had already seen. He was not expressive in the way of someone unguarded, but he was expressive in the way of someone whose control was very good but not perfect. Small tells around the eyes, and the set of his jaw, that she was learning to read. He felt things intensely. He simply had a great deal of practice not showing it. On the 3rd day, she asked him about his pack. She had been thinking about it since the first morning. The political situation he had described in those careful, precise sentences. The council that had moved against him. The territory that was presumably continuing to operate in his absence with someone covering for him, or a power vacuum forming, or both. He had not volunteered further information, and she had not pressed, waiting until she felt the conversation could hold it, which was an instinct she had developed in field work and applied to most complex situations. He was quiet for a long moment after she asked, sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of tea, looking out the window at the mountain. "There are approximately 300 people in my immediate territory," he said finally. "Families, some of whom have lived there for 4 or 5 generations. Businesses, schools, a medical facility, a council house that is currently operating without its alpha." His jaw tightened. "My second Rowan is covering my absence as a planned retreat. That was the contingency we established for emergency disappearances. He has approximately 10 days before the cover story becomes untenable and we move into a different kind of crisis." 10 days, she said. "And you have 4 or 5 before you can move safely." "Yes. Who are the 3 council members?" "The ones who moved against you," he told her. "Aldrich Vane, who controlled the eastern trade routes and had been arguing for a decade that the Ashwood territory should expand, more aggressively at the expense of neighboring packs. Sarah Donholt, who ran the council's intelligence network and had, Kaelin now suspected, been feeding information to outside parties for years. And Marcus Fell, the youngest of the three, the one whose involvement surprised him most, a man he had personally mentored in governance, who had evidently decided that loyalty was a less efficient path to power than alliance with the other two. "What will you do when you go back?" she asked. "Remove them from the council, formally, with documentation of their actions presented to the full pack assembly. They will be given the choice of exile or trial." His voice was even. "I will not execute them unless the assembly decides that is necessary and just. I don't believe in summary justice regardless of provocation." She had not expected that. She had been building a picture of him in her mind across 3 days, adding detail to the initial sketch of the large, careful, controlled man who had appeared in her living room, and she had left the question of what kind of alpha he actually was deliberately open. What she had seen suggested capability and intelligence, and a certain quality of contained power that she associated with effective leadership. What she had not yet determined was what he led toward. "That's not the standard response," she said. "The standard response is counterproductive," he said. "Summary execution of council members, even treasonous ones, creates martyrs and drives the factions that supported them underground rather than dispersing them. It demonstrates that the Alpha's authority rests on force rather than legitimacy, which means every subsequent challenge will be a question of whether your force is sufficient rather than whether your position is right." He looked at her. "I want to be an Alpha whose authority is legitimate, not merely one who cannot be successfully challenged." She looked at him for a moment. How many Alphas actually think that way? "Not enough," he said quietly, "which is part of the problem." That night, lying in her bed listening to the mountains settle around her cabin in its familiar nighttime sounds, Alara thought about the word legitimate and what it meant to want authority to be that rather than merely effective. And she thought about her mother choosing isolation over engagement with a world that wanted her dead. And she thought about all the ways in which safety and smallness were sometimes the same thing and sometimes were not. She was not ready to decide anything, but she was thinking, which was more than she had been doing with her life for 4 years. Before we get to what happens next, I just want to take a second to ask, are you on Kaelin's side yet? Because this community is genuinely divided, and I want to know where you are at this point in the story. Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because the next part of this story is going to require you to be here for it. Okay, let's go. On the 4th day the men came. Ilara heard the snowmobiles first, 2 of them by the sound, moving fast up the mountain access road that most people didn't know about, and all the people who did know about it had no reason to use without calling her first. She was in the animal recovery unit checking on her foxes when she heard them, and she stood very still for 3 seconds, processing the sound and its implications before she went inside. Kaelin was already at the window when she came through the door, standing to the side of it in a way that suggested long practice with situational awareness. His posture changed from the relative ease of the past 3 days into something coiled and ready. He had heard them too, clearly, with senses better than hers. "How many?" she asked. 2 snowmobiles. 3 people, I think. 1 riding double. His nostrils flared slightly in a way she had noticed him do when he was reading information from the air. Scent being, she had gathered, one of the primary senses in his other form, and not entirely absent in this one. "I don't recognize the scents, which means they are not from my territory." A pause, which suggests they are either Vane's people or Don Holt's contacts from outside. "Could they have tracked you here?" The storm should have covered everything, but 3 days have passed and Don Holt is very good at her work. His jaw was tight. "I am sorry. I brought this to you. Deal with the apology later," she said, which was how she handled most apologies when there was a more immediate problem. She was already moving toward the back of the cabin where she kept her emergency kit and her father's old hunting rifle, which she maintained in working order because isolated mountain living was not the place to be sentimental about practical tools. She was loading it when Kaelin appeared in the doorway behind her. "You should go out the back," he said. "Into the tree line. I can handle—" "This is my cabin," she said, without turning around. And you are 4 days recovered from a curse that nearly killed you. What's your actual capacity right now? A pause that told her the answer before he gave it. Sufficient for 2, possibly 3. Not for 3 well-armed operatives in good condition. Then we do it together, she said, and turned around. She held the rifle with the ease of someone who had grown up in mountains and knew what it was for. How do we play it? He looked at her for a moment with that unreadable expression that she was beginning to read anyway, the one that appeared when she did something that recalibrated his expectations. Then he nodded, once, and began to tell her what he knew about how Donholt's outside contacts operated. They were at the door before the snowmobiles reached the clearing. 3 people, as Kaelin had guessed, 2 men and a woman, wearing the kind of winter gear that was practical rather than fashionable, and moving with the trained efficiency of people who did this for a living. They stopped when they saw Kaelin on the porch. The woman's hand moved toward the weapon at her hip. "Ilara," Kaelin said quietly, not looking away from the 3 in the clearing. "There is a mark on the back of the taller man's left hand. Can you see it from where you are?" She was standing just inside the doorway to his left, the rifle in her hands. She looked at the taller man's left hand. There was a mark there, the kind of deliberate mark she had learned in the past 4 days to read as a supernatural identifier, though not one she recognized. "Yes," she said. "That mark belongs to the Thornfield Compact. They are mercenaries aligned with whoever pays them. It also means they are not here to take me back. They are here to finish the job." His voice remained completely even. "When I step forward, I need you to cover the woman on the right. She is left-handed, and her weapon is already half drawn." "Got it," she said. What happened in the next 45 seconds was the most concentrated experience of Ilara's life up to that point, which was saying something given what the last 4 days had already contained. Kaelin stepped forward, and the quality of the air around him changed in a way she felt, rather than saw. The contained power she had been reading in him for 4 days, releasing several layers of its containment, his voice dropping to a register that resonated in the chest cavity when he spoke, and told the 3 people in the clearing that they had one opportunity to leave, and that he strongly recommended they take it. The shorter man lunged. Kaelin moved with a speed that her eyes tried to track and lost. The woman's weapon cleared its holster. Ilara put a warning shot in the snow 18 inches to her left. The woman froze. It was over in less time than it would take to describe it properly. 2 of the 3 were on the ground in the snow, not dead, but emphatically not interested in continuing the encounter. The third, the taller man with the Thornfield mark, was standing with his hands visible in the universal language of people who had reassessed their position. "Tell Vane," Kaelin said, "that I'm coming home, and that I'm bringing evidence." The man left. His 2 companions helped each other to their feet and followed, and the sound of the snowmobiles faded back down the mountain, and Ilara stood on her porch with her rifle and her heart rate returning to manageable levels and the clear, cold mountain air filling her lungs. "You knew they would run," she said. "I knew that one of them would," Kaelin said. "The Thornfield Compact is mercenary. When the job becomes unprofitable, they disengage. Killing or capturing an Ashwood Alpha who is clearly functional and aware is a much more complicated and dangerous job than killing an injured wolf in a snowstorm." He turned to look at her. The warning shot was good. "I know," she said. And then, because the adrenaline was still in her blood, and it required an outlet of some kind. "You said you were bringing evidence. Do you have evidence?" "I have testimony," he said. "Mine, and the pattern of decisions that Vane and Donholt have made over the past 2 years that, assembled, constitute a record of intent. What I need is documentation. And the person who can help me get it," he paused, "is someone who has been living in your area for the past 3 years. Someone I believe you may know." She stared at him. "Who?" "A man named Callum. Ward," he said. "He is a retired supernatural archivist. He lives approximately 12 kilometers east of here, and based on what I know of your social connections in this area, I believe you may have treated one of his dogs." She had treated 2 of his dogs, as it happened. A border collie with a leg injury 18 months ago, and a shepherd mix with an eye infection 6 months after that. Callum Ward was a quiet, precise man in his 60s who drank excellent tea and always paid his bills in cash and had never once in 3 interactions done or said anything that she would now characterize as supernatural. She was revising that assessment in real time. "Of course," she said, and there was something almost like laughter in it, the kind of laughter that was mostly about the strangeness of the world. "Of course he is." Callum Ward opened his door before they knocked, which Alara noted as the first confirmation of Kaylin's information, since ordinary retired people did not possess the situational awareness required to hear 2 people on snowshoes crossing a mountain in winter. He looked at Kaylin with the measured assessment of someone who had known what to expect. And he looked at Alara with something more complicated, something that contained recognition and guilt in proportions that told her the story before he said a word. "You knew my mother," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come in. I owe you both a great deal of explaining, and I would rather do it somewhere warm." Callum Ward had been, in his professional life, the primary archivist for a council of supernatural territories that included the Ashwood lands. He had maintained records of decisions, alliances, contracts, and violations for 40 years. He had retired 3 years ago, when the political climate had shifted in ways that made him concerned for his safety, bringing with him, she gathered, copies of significantly more documentation than his former employers would have approved of his retaining. He had known Ilara's mother. He had, in fact, been the one who had confirmed for her mother, 16 years ago, that the accident that had killed her own mother had not been an accident, which was the information that had sent her mother into hiding. He had maintained loose contact ever since. He had known when she died. He had debated for 4 years whether to approach her daughter. "What stopped you?" Ilara asked. "Your mother's specific request," he said quietly. "She wanted you to have the choice. To not know. She believed the knowledge was a burden, and that you had suffered enough loss, and that it should be your decision, not mine, to take on more." Ilara sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, very much like her mother. It was also, she thought, the kind of protection that looked like kindness and functioned like a cage. "I want to know," she said. "All of it," he told them. He told them about the systematic campaign against the Guardian bloodlines, conducted over 3 generations by a faction within the supernatural governance structure that Kaylin, listening with an expression of carefully managed fury, confirmed he had suspected, but not had proof of. He told them about Ilara's grandmother and the knowledge she had carried. He told them about Ilara's mother and what she had known and why it had made her dangerous. He told them, carefully, and with the specific detail of a man who kept records because he understood their weight, what he believed had happened. On that winter road 4 years ago, it had not been an accident. Ilara had suspected this for 4 years, in the part of herself that she had refused to listen to, the part that had kept asking questions her brain had overridden with the necessity of simply functioning. Hearing it confirmed was not what she had expected. It was not the reopening of a wound. It was instead the strange clarifying quality of a suspicion resolved, grief shifting from the vague and formless thing it had been into, something with edges and a direction, and potentially a path toward something that was not quite justice, but was adjacent to it. "The documentation you have," Kaylin said to Callum, his voice controlled and careful. "Does it connect Vane or Dawnholt to this faction?" "Dawnholt," Callum said. "Directly. I have correspondence, 14 years of it." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had weight. "Then I need to ask you," Kaylin said, "to come with us, to Ashwood, to present that documentation before the full pack assembly in a formal accountability proceeding." He paused. "I understand the risk I am asking you to accept. I want to be clear that I am asking, not requiring." Callum Ward looked at Kaylin for a long moment, with the appraising look of a man who had spent 40 years watching how people in power made requests. Then he looked at Ilara. "Are you going?" he asked. She had not decided. She had been holding the decision at arm's length since the first morning, since the conversation about legitimate authority and the 4 years she had spent making herself small and safe. She thought about her mother and the cage that had looked like kindness. She thought about Daniel and the road, and the 4 years since. Yes, she said, and it was only after she said it that she realized she had decided, somewhere in the preceding days, without quite noticing when. Kaelin looked at her and said nothing, but something in his expression settled, some tension she had not realized was there releasing, and she filed that away in the growing catalog of things about him that she was learning to read. Then yes, Callum said. I'll come. They left the following morning, the 5th day, Kaelin having assessed himself as sufficiently recovered, and all 3 of them having agreed that waiting any longer increased the risk of the council situation becoming unmanageable. Callum had a vehicle, a practical 4-wheel drive that handled mountain roads with the confidence of something that had been doing it for years, and the 3 of them fit into it along with Callum's considerable archive of documentation and Alara's necessary supplies, with the practiced efficiency of people who had already done the harder work of deciding to go. The Ashwood territory was a 4-hour drive from the mountain, through landscapes that shifted from the high wilderness of Alara's home range, through lower mountain forest, and eventually into a valley that announced itself as different from the surrounding terrain in ways she felt before she understood. The air changed, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to in a scientific paper, but in the way that certain places had of declaring their own significance, a density of presence that her senses registered as meaningful, even as her rational mind noted. It had no framework for explaining. She mentioned this to Kaelin, who was in the passenger seat. You're feeling the territory's resonance, he said. The land holds the accumulation of generations of pack life. Guardias da Frontera are particularly sensitive to it. He paused. Your mother would have felt it strongly here. She visited once when I was young. I remember her. Alara turned to look at him. You knew my mother? I was 10, he said. I remember her as a serious woman who spoke very precisely and looked at everything as if she was recording it, a slight softening around his eyes. She was very kind to a 10-year-old who kept asking her questions about things his tutors had told him were outside the standard curriculum. She turned back to the road and did not speak for a moment, processing the idea that the thread connecting her life to this world had been longer than she knew. What kinds of questions? She asked finally. Whether the governance structures of supernatural territories were actually just or merely effective, he said. She told me the answer was complicated and that the work of making them more was more important than debating the question theoretically. A pause. It was the most useful thing any adult told me in my entire childhood. Alara thought about her mother, serious and precise and kind, pointing a 10-year-old alpha heir toward the question that would eventually define his leadership philosophy. And she felt something grief-adjacent, but not entirely grief. Something that had more warmth in it. That sounds like her, she said softly. The Ashwood pack house was not what Alara had imagined, which had tended, she realized, toward the architectural of Gothic fantasy. It was a large, practical, well-maintained complex of buildings set into the valley's lower slope, designed with the logic of a functioning community. Central gathering spaces, residential wings, administrative offices, the kind of layout that prioritized utility alongside dignity. It was full of people when they arrived, which told her that Rowan had maintained the cover story successfully enough, that normal operations were continuing, and it was the kind of full of people that registered Kaelin's arrival within 30 seconds and produced a ripple effect of response that moved through the complex with the efficiency of a PAX communication system. Rowan was at the vehicle before the engine stopped. He was a few years younger than Kaelin, lighter built, with the quick, precise movements of someone whose primary skill was information management rather than direct confrontation, and his relief at seeing Kaelin was unguarded in a way that told Alara it was genuine. He gripped Kaelin's forearm in the particular clasped greeting she had seen described in Callum's historical documents as a traditional pack acknowledgement. You had me at 8 days, he said. Not 10. I was delayed, Kaelin said. I will explain everything. But first, where is Vane? Administrative wing, Rowan said. He's been positioning himself as acting coordinator in your absence. Carefully. Nothing that would constitute a formal claim. His eyes moved to Alara and Callum, with the quick assessment of someone cataloging new variables. "Who are these people?" "The person who saved my life," Kaylin said, with a simplicity that made the words land with more weight than an elaborate introduction would have. "And the person who has 14 years of documentation that will end Sarah Donholt's career." He turned briefly toward the complex. "Call a full assembly for this evening. I need 4 hours to prepare." "Done," Rowan said immediately. The 4 hours were among the most concentrated of Alara's life, which was developing a pattern of setting new records in that category. She was given a room and shown the facilities with the efficient hospitality of a pack that apparently extended courtesy to alpha guests as a matter of operational practice. Callum disappeared with Rowan to begin organizing his documentation into an order of presentation. Kaylin disappeared into what she gathered were his private offices, and for the first time since the night of the storm, she did not have direct sight of him, which she noticed more than she expected to. She used the 4 hours to think. The room she had been given had a window that looked out over the valley, the Ashwood territory spreading below her in the late afternoon light, and she stood at it for a long time, letting her mind work through what was coming. She had come here as a witness, as an adjunct to Kaylin's return, as the person who had the practical knowledge of what had been done to him and why. She did not have a formal role in what was about to happen. She was not Pack. She was not supernatural. She was a wildlife veterinarian from a mountain cabin who had once pulled a wolf out of the snow and whose life had changed into something she did not yet have a complete map of. She also had, Callum had told her that morning in the car, a legal claim on a piece of the documentation he was carrying. Correspondence between Donholt and the faction that had targeted her family. Evidence that directly related to her mother's death. Evidence she could theoretically take to human legal authorities. Though Callum had been precise in his explanation of why that was complicated and unlikely to produce results. Or she could present within the Pack's own accountability structure, where it would be understood and actionable in ways the human legal system simply wasn't equipped for. It was, she realized, exactly what her mother's contact with the 10-year-old Kaylin had been about. The question of whether the governance structures were just, or merely effective. The question of whether those inside them would do the work of making them more just. She was standing at the window of that governance structure now, deciding whether to engage with it or to remain outside looking in. When Kaylin knocked at her door an hour before the assembly, she had already decided. She was not surprised when he seemed to read this in her before she said it. "You're presenting your portion yourself," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had that careful quality she recognized as the one he used when he was saying something that carried more weight for him than the words themselves would indicate. "I want to be clear that I did not bring you here for that purpose. I did not need you to engage beyond witnessing. I know," she said, "and that the risk, I know," she said again. "Kaylin." She waited until he looked at her directly. "My mother spent 16 years keeping me safe by keeping me out of this. I spent 4 years after her death keeping myself safe by keeping myself out of everything. I am done keeping myself out of things that matter." She held his gaze. "Are you done trying to manage my risk assessment? Or can we go prepare for the assembly?" The full smile appeared for the first time. She had been catching the edges of it for 5 days. The beginning of it, the suppressed version, and the complete version was, she noted with the clinical part of her mind, significant. It changed his face in a way that made him look like someone who had, in some other life, been allowed to be younger than his position required. "We can go prepare," he said. The assembly hall of the Ashwood Pack House was designed for exactly this kind of event, which told her something about how seriously this community took the idea of collective accountability. It was a large, well-lit, wood-paneled space, with tiered seating around a central floor, built to accommodate everyone in the territory who wanted to attend and structured so that the proceedings were visible and audible from every seat. It was full. Nearly every seat was taken by the time the assembly was formally opened, the faces of the pack ranging from the openly anxious to the carefully neutral to the small percentage she could identify as probably aligned with Vane or Donholt, by the way. They watched the central floor with calculated assessment rather than genuine uncertainty. Vane was present. He sat in the council section with the polished composure of someone who had prepared for multiple scenarios and was currently determining which one he was in. He was a man in his 50s, with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades being the most effective person in most rooms he entered. And Alara watched him watching Kaelin walk in, and saw the precise moment when he decided on his strategy. He was going to deny everything. He was going to position this as a misunderstanding, as a tragic accident of politics and miscommunication. And he was going to do it with the practiced confidence of someone who had survived worse crises through sheer force of narrative management. Dawnholt was not present. Her seat in the council section was empty. Rowan, standing at Kaelin's right, leaned close and murmured something, and Kaelin's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. Dawnholt had disappeared from the complex that morning. She had known or guessed what was coming, and she had run. That information rippled through the assembly in whispers before Kaelin called for order. He called for it quietly, with a simple lift of one hand, and it came with the immediacy of a community that knew the weight of that gesture. And Alara, watching from the floor beside Callum, understood something about legitimate authority in that moment that she had only previously understood abstractly. He spoke for 20 minutes. He described what had happened on the mountain, without embellishment, and without obscuring the parts that reflected poorly on his own judgment. The trust he had extended to Vane and Dawnholt over years that they had been exploiting, the gaps in his attention to the internal politics of his own council that they had maneuvered in. He was, she thought, the most honest person she had ever watched conduct a formal proceeding, and the assembly's response to that honesty was visible in the quality of their silence. The particular attentiveness of people who recognized they were being treated as adults capable of handling a complicated truth. Then Callum presented. He was precise and methodical and utterly devastating. 14 years of correspondence and transaction records assembled into a narrative that left no reasonable alternate interpretation. Dawnholt's connections to the faction that had been systematically targeting Guardian bloodlines were clear and documented. Her involvement in the planning of the attempt on Kaelin's life was circumstantially strong and directly evidenced enough that the assembly understood what they were looking at. Then Alara spoke. She had not planned a speech. She had planned, essentially, a statement of fact. What she had found, what she had done, what she knew about her mother, and what the documentation connected to her family. She delivered it in the direct, precise manner of someone giving a report, and she watched the assembly's reaction shift and deepen as they understood who she was and what the presence of a guardian's daughter in this hall meant, the weight of the connection between her bloodline and the territory's history. When she finished, the silence lasted for 4 seconds. Vane rose and began to speak. He was, as she had assessed, very good. His narrative was constructed with real skill, acknowledging what could not be denied, questioning what could be questioned, positioning himself as someone who had made errors of judgment rather than deliberate choices of betrayal. He was building, she could see, toward a version of events in which he was culpable of poor judgment, but not of treason, which was the version that would save him from the most serious consequences. She watched Kaelin listen to him. Kaelin let him speak completely without interruption, which surprised some people in the assembly, she could see, and which she had come to understand was not courtesy, but strategy. When Vane finished, Kaelin asked a single question. The question was about a meeting that had taken place 14 months ago, in a location Vane had given in his remarks as evidence of his legitimate activity during that period. The question was specific and technical, and concerned a detail that could only be known to someone who had access to Callum's documentation, the kind of specific detail that would either be confirmed or contradicted by the records, and that if contradicted would demolish the entire narrative Vane had just spent 20 minutes constructing. Vane paused for exactly 2 seconds before answering. It was 2 seconds too long. The assembly saw it. The vote was not close. Let's take a breath here, because what just happened is exactly the kind of thing this community comes to this channel for. Not just the supernatural romance, but the justice. The moment when the narrative shifts and the truth wins. Tell me in the comments what you thought of Alara's choice to speak. Tell me if you saw Vane's 2-second pause coming, And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Because this story has at least 3 more turns before we reach the ending. Stay with us. The aftermath of the assembly took 2 days to process in the formal sense. The documentation of the proceedings, the formal removal of Vane and the 2 other council members from their positions, the issuance of the exile order that gave them 30 days to leave Ashwood territory, the dispatch of a search protocol for Dawnholt that was coordinated with 3 neighboring territories, and which, Rowan told her on the second evening, had already located her in a border region where she appeared to believe she had found sanctuary. She had not found sanctuary. She had found a trap she had not recognized as one, which was, Alara privately thought, a fitting outcome for someone who had made her career in intelligence operations. Marcus Fell, the youngest of the 3 conspirators, the one Kaelin had personally mentored, had remained in the complex throughout the assembly and its aftermath. He had not attempted to flee, and he had not attempted to deny his involvement, both of which, in Kaelin's assessment, and in Alara's reading of the situation, indicated that he was in a different category than the other 2. Not innocent, not absolved, but possibly someone whose involvement had been manipulation, rather than genuine. Alignment. Kaelin spent 3 hours with him on the second day in a conversation that Alara was not part of and did not try to be, and when it ended, Marcus Fell was assigned to a supervised rehabilitation process rather than exile, which prompted a conversation between Alara and Kaelin that evening that told her more about both of them than either had managed to communicate directly. "You think I was too lenient," he said. They were sitting on the steps outside the main building in the cold, the Pathum valley spread below them in the early dark of a winter evening, and she had learned enough of his silences to know that this one was asking a genuine question. "I think it's more complicated than lenient versus appropriate," she said carefully. "I think you're right that he was manipulated. I think you're right that distinguishing between people who chose this and people who were maneuvered into it matters. I also think that your personal investment in his development means you're going to have to work harder to assess him objectively than you would with someone you had less history with." He was quiet for a moment. "You think I'm blind to him? I think you're aware of the risk of being blind to him, which is different," she said. "I think the supervised process is reasonable. I think you should not be the one supervising it directly." He turned to look at her. "You've been here 2 days. I have good pattern recognition," she said. "It's most of the job in wildlife work. You read what you can observe and you build a model, and you test the model against new observations. I've been observing you for a week. And what is your model?" he said, with a quality in his voice she was becoming familiar with, the tone of someone asking a genuine question while managing the risk of the answer. She thought about how to answer this honestly, without saying more than the moment required. "I think you are someone who takes care of things as a primary mode of existing in the world," she said. "Your pack, your territory, your people. I think you do it well, partly from genuine care, and partly from a very well-developed sense of responsibility. I think the weakness of that mode is that it makes it difficult for you to accept care in return, because accepting care requires acknowledging vulnerability. And you have spent a very long time in a position where vulnerability was dangerous." The silence after this was different from his other silences. Longer, with a different quality. "That is a very accurate model," he said finally. "You're welcome," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the same almost quality she had been catching at the edges of for a week. "What's your model of yourself?" he said. "A person who made herself small for 4 years after a loss, and is currently figuring out how to be the size she actually is again," she said. The directness of it surprised her slightly. She had not planned to say it quite that way. With some assistance from an injured wolf in a snowstorm. He looked at her for a long time in the winter dark. The light from the building behind them caught the gold of his eyes, that impossible warm gold that she had come to associate with the specific quality of his attention when it was fully directed somewhere. "Alara," he said. Her name and his voice had a particular quality she had been not quite noticing for a week, and was now noticing entirely. "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "Stay," he said. "Not permanently if that's not what you want. Not in any capacity that compromises your independence or your work. But stay long enough for us to properly figure out what is happening here. between us and between you and this territory, and between the guardian lineage and the work this community needs to do going forward. He paused. I am asking because I want you to, not because it is strategically useful, though it is also that. I want to be accurate about both. She thought about her cabin, and her foxes and the mountain, about the barn owl that would need 2 more weeks of recovery before she could be released, about the life she had built in the shape of grief. She thought about her mother, and the choice her mother had made, and the other choice, the one that had led her, somehow, to pointing a 10-year-old toward the question of just versus merely effective. I need to go back for my animals, she said. I have a barn owl in recovery, and 3 foxes who are not ready to be on their own. Of course, he said. There was something in the way he said it. The simple, immediate accommodation of her work as a given, rather than an obstacle, that she felt in her chest. After I've settled them, she said, I'll come back. He nodded. The word that came from him next was quiet, and carried more in it than its single syllable contained. Good, he said. She turned back to the valley view. The lights of the Ashwood community scattered below them in the dark, like a fallen piece of the night sky. And she sat beside him in the cold, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was not grief, and not its absence, but something genuinely different, something that had the quality of beginning. She did go back. She spent 4 days at her cabin settling her animals, coordinating the transfer of her ongoing rehabilitation cases to a colleague 2 valleys over, who had been gently suggesting for 3 years that Alara worked too much in isolation, and making the practical arrangements for a longer absence than she had initially planned, because she had been honest with herself enough to know that whatever was beginning was going to require time. She sat in the cabin the last evening, by the fire in the same armchair where she had watched over a wolf in the snow, and she had a quiet conversation with the version of herself who had moved here 4 years ago, in the shape of her grief. That version had needed this place, and what it had given her. The stillness, and the animals, and the mountains and the work. She did not have to leave it behind to leave it. It would be here when she returned, and she would return, because some things you built from grief were genuinely worth keeping, rather than leaving. But it was not where her life lived anymore. She had realized this sometime in the last 10 days. In the spaces between crisis and conversation, and the slow, complex work of understanding a person who was simultaneously exactly what she had not expected, and precisely what she recognized. She drove back to Ashwood on a clear morning, the mountain roads clean and dry after a week of good weather, and she was met at the territory boundary by a child on a fast little pony, who informed her with great seriousness that she had been sent to escort the guardian's daughter to the pack house, and that her name was Mira, and she was 9 and she had 7 questions about wildlife rehabilitation that she hoped Alara would have time to answer. Alara laughed, genuinely and fully, and said that she had time for all 7 questions, and possibly more. And Mira beamed and wheeled her pony around and led the way into the valley at a pace that required Alara to accelerate slightly to keep up, which she did without minding at all. Kaelin was at the main building when she arrived. He had been in a meeting, she gathered from the presence of 3 serious-looking people, who were concluding their conversation as she came up the steps, and he had stepped out mid-conclusion to meet her, which she noted as a thing that carried weight. The 3 serious-looking people noted it too, in their expressions, and she filed away the political communication of that gesture for later processing. You made good time, he said. The roads were clear, she said. They stood for a moment in the winter morning light, and Mira, who had handed off her pony to a stable hand with the efficiency of a child who had been riding since before she could walk, was watching them from 10 feet away, with the unabashed interest of someone who had not yet learned to perform disinterest. Alara glanced at her, and then back at Kaelin, who looked at her in the way she had learned to read, as meaning he was about to say something that carried more than the words. I'm glad you came back, he said. I said I would, she said. People say things, he said. I don't, she said. And then, because he was looking at her with those impossible gold eyes in the winter light, was doing something unreasonable, and she had spent 4 years being careful and small, and she was done with that. Were you worried? the full smile again, the one that changed his face. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, which made him laugh, which she was beginning to think might be her favorite sound in this new world she was learning to live in. The reconstruction of the Ashwood Council took 3 months. Kaelin approached it the way he approached most things, with methodical attention to both the practical requirements and the underlying principles. And he included Alara in the process in a way that she initially questioned and came to understand was deliberate and right. The Guardian perspective, he told her, was precisely what governance structures needed more of. The view from outside the system, observant and neutral, and committed to clarity over political advantage. She was not Pac. She never became Pac, which was not, she came to understand, a deficiency but a characteristic. The thing that made her presence in these conversations genuinely useful, rather than merely additional. She contributed to the revision of the accountability structures that had allowed 3 council members to operate in conspiracy for years without detection. The new oversight protocols and the documentation requirements, and the quarterly reviews that gave ordinary PAC members formal channels for raising concerns about leadership decisions. It was, she thought, the most directly useful thing she had done with her mind in her professional life, which had always valued the analytical and the systematic, and had not previously found a context large enough for the full application of both. She also, in the 3rd month, received formal confirmation of what Callum's documentation had suggested and what a proper investigation had subsequently confirmed. Her mother's death had been deliberate. The faction responsible had been the same one Dawnholt had been working with, and the exposure of Dawnholt's network had provided the information necessary to identify and document their actions. 3 people were, by the end of that month, facing the particular form of supernatural accountability that the combined territories were able to bring to bear on those who had operated within their boundaries. It was not the human justice system, and it did not follow human legal process, but it was thorough, and it was consequential, and it was, Alara found, sufficient. She did not feel healed, exactly. She did not think grief worked that way, but she felt something she had not felt for 4 years, a sense of the world making a particular kind of sense, action, and consequence, and the possibility of things being different than they had been. Her mother had known this world, and had chosen to protect her from it, and had paid a price for that choice. She had chosen to enter it, and was still here, and that felt like something, some continuation or answer. Not neat, but real. Kaelin asked her, in the 4th month, what she wanted to build. They were sitting together in his office late in the evening. The paperwork of governance spread between them in the comfortable disorder of 2 people who worked well together, and he asked it simply. Looking at her directly in the way she had come to know meant he was asking the real question, rather than a version of it. "I want to build something for people like my mother," she said. "People in the in-between. Guardians, their descendants. Humans who have been touched by this world enough to need its accountability structures but not its politics. I want there to be somewhere they can go that is genuinely safe and genuinely connected." She paused. This territory could be that. "If you want it to be." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what you need to make it happen," he said. She told him. He listened with his full attention, which she had come to think of as one of the most reliable things about him, his genuine and complete attentiveness to things that mattered, and he asked precise questions and made 3 specific suggestions, and disagreed with one element of her plan on grounds that she subsequently agreed were valid. And by the end of the evening, they had the outline of something that was genuinely new in the structural history of the supernatural territories of the Northern Range. It was not romance yet, technically, though it had been everything else that romance is before the word applies, and it became that shortly afterward, in the way of things that have been building long enough that when they arrive they feel inevitable, rather than sudden. It was not dramatic. It was, in keeping with who both of them were, honest and somewhat awkward and completely certain. 2 people who had spent considerable time learning each other's shape before deciding what to do with that knowledge. She told him, on a morning in the 5th month, that she loved him, because she had learned that saying true, things simply and directly was more efficient than alternatives, And she watched him receive this information with the particular expression she had catalogued on that first morning as vulnerability, the face of someone who had not fully expected to be cared for in this specific way. "I love you," he said back, with a simplicity that matched hers. And then, with the edge of that smile, "Thank you for saving my life." "You thanked me for that already," she said. "I will probably keep thanking you," he said. It was a fairly significant event. "It was," she agreed. "The wolf was very dramatic." He laughed, genuinely, fully, and she thought that 4 years ago she would not have been able to imagine a morning that felt like this one. And that was all right, because she had not needed to imagine it then. She had only needed to walk toward the dark shape in the snow instead of away from it, and everything else had followed from that. The marking on his chest, she learned over time, was older than the Ashwood line. It was a mark that appeared in the historical record at the boundary points, the moments when the supernatural world had been in enough crisis that the in-between people, the guardians, had stepped into the center of things and held them together. It had appeared on the first Ashwood Alpha, 400 years ago, in a time of civil war between the territories. It had reappeared periodically since, always in times of significant transition, always in connection with the guardian presence in the territory's history. Callum, who had moved into the Ashwood territory permanently and was in the process of cataloging 4 decades of disorganized archives into an accessible and functional institutional record, told her this on an afternoon in the 6th month when he had been working on the early history sections, and had found a reference he thought she would want to see. "It was always a sign," he said, "but not the way the old texts framed it. Not destiny in the deterministic sense. More like a recognition. The mark identifies the moment when the two modes of engaging with the world, the supernatural and the in-between, are in genuine alignment rather than parallel. When someone like you and someone like him are working toward the same thing for the same reasons." He paused. "The mark doesn't create that alignment. It recognizes it when it occurs." Ilara looked at the illustration in the old text he had opened, the marking rendered in painstaking detail, by someone 400 years ago. Exactly the same design as the one on Kaelin's chest. "Does it always appear this way?" she asked. "Only when both parties are present," Callum said. "In periods between, the carriers of the mark often don't know they have it." She went home and told Kaelin this, sitting across the table from him over dinner in the comfortable, ordinary fashion of people who have made a home together. And she watched him look down at his own chest for a moment. At the marking. That was simply part of him, that she had stopped seeing as strange and begun to see as the particular fact of who he was. "Does it change anything for you?" he asked. Knowing it was a recognition, she thought about the night of the storm and the flashlight, and her hand moving toward the marking before she decided to move it, drawn by something she could not name. She thought about the wolves and the mountains, and her mother, and all the ways in which a life assembled from grief could find its way, eventually, to something that was not just its continuation. "No," she said. "I already knew." Epilogue. 3 years later, the Threshold House opened in the Ashwood territory, the first formal sanctuary and support structure for guardians and liminal humans in the Northern Range. It was Ilara's design, built with Kaelin's resources, and the genuine enthusiasm of a community that had come to understand, in the years since the assembly, what it meant to be a territory that aspired to legitimacy, rather than merely effectiveness. The opening brought people she had not expected, guardians from territories she had not known existed, descendants of bloodlines that had gone underground a generation ago, humans who had spent years navigating the edge of the supernatural world without resources or connection or language for what they experienced. She spent 3 days meeting them, listening to them, building in real time a picture of the need this space was meeting that was both larger and more specific than she had imagined. Mira, who was 12 now, and had all 9 questions she had saved since their first meeting answered to her satisfaction, plus an internship in Ilara's rebuilt wildlife rehabilitation unit, helped manage the logistics with the particular competence of a child who had grown up in a well-run community and absorbed its standards. She told Alara on the second evening, with 9-year-old directness slightly refined by 3 additional years, that she had decided she wanted to do this work when she was older, the in-between work, the work of the guardians. You have time to decide, Alara told her. I know, Mira said, with 12-year-old certainty. I've already decided. I'm just giving myself time to confirm it. Alara laughed and sent her off with a list of tasks, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the new building watching the light fall across the valley she had come to know as well as her mountain. Different in its qualities, but equally hers. Equally real. Kaylin found her there at the end of the day, as the last visitors were settling into their accommodations and the opening events were winding down. And he stood beside her in the doorway, and they looked at what she had built together with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who have worked hard for something good. Your mother would have wanted to see this, he said. Yes, she said. I think she knew it was possible. I think that's partly why she kept you. Pointed toward the question. He took her hand, which was a simple gesture in the language of them. The ordinary, quiet gesture of 2 people who had built something real. What question do you want to point Mira toward? He said. She thought about it. Outside, the valley was settling into evening, the lights coming on in the pack houses and the roads, the particular warm, scattered pattern of a community going about the ordinary business of its lives. She thought about legitimate and effective, and the work between them. She thought about the wolf in the snow, and the marking that was not a sign of destiny, but a recognition of alignment, of 2 ways of being in the world, finding their common purpose. Whether it is possible, she said, to build something so genuinely just that the people living inside it choose to protect it not because they are told to, but because it belongs to them. Kaylin was quiet for a moment. Then, that is a good question. I learned from the best, she said. He squeezed her hand, and they stood together in the doorway of what they had made, watching the valley hold the light of another evening, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. And it was the kind of beginning that does not announce itself as ending, because it does not end. It only deepens. The way a mark recognized is not a destination but a direction, and the direction was forward, and the forward was theirs. And that is the story of the woman who pulled a wolf from the snow and found, in doing it, the world she had been kept from and the life she was large enough to live. If this story moved you, if Alara's choice in that doorway resonated, if Kaylin's particular brand of legitimate authority is the kind of leadership you want to see more stories about, please leave us a comment. Tell us which moment hit you hardest. Tell us about the mark and what you think it means. And subscribe if you haven't already, because this channel exists to tell exactly this kind of story. The ones where the supernatural is a language for the very human work of building something worth protecting. We'll see you in the next one.